Guam is the strategic hub of the U.S. in the Western Pacific. There is no
Right.
getting around its military importance. I would suggest embrace it, but it also means that there's a need for high tech competencies, skilled
Right.
labor, welding, electrical,
Yeah.
all of these things that you need to repair and sustain military aircraft, ships. It'd be better if we had the way to train and work with islanders on the island.
Yes.
So not just limited to Guamanians, the folks living in Guam, but more broadly.
Half a day. It's your innovation coach, Rob Jackson, and welcome to another edition of the Innovate Guam Podcast, the podcast where we explore all things innovation, technology, and improvement related to the island of Guam. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Substack. My podcasts drop at the beginning of each week. Also, be sure to check out my Innovate column in the Pacific Daily News every first and third Friday of each month. Our guest for today is Brent D. Sadler, Captain, United States Navy, retired, and he's a returning guest. Brent currently serves as Senior Research Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology at the Heritage Foundation, where he focuses on maritime security, naval modernization, and the technologies shaping the future of sea power. Before entering the policy arena, Brent completed a distinguished 26-year career in the United States Navy. He began as a nuclear-trained submarine officer and later served as a foreign area officer and military diplomat in Asia. He is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy with a degree in systems engineering, and he later studied in Japan as an Olmsted Scholar before earning advanced degrees at Jochi University and the National War College. Brent is also the author of multiple books on maritime competition and U.S. naval strategy, connecting policy, industrial capacity, and real world execution. All right, today is a little different. This isn't Brent's first time on the Innovate Guam podcast. Brent Sadler returns at a critical moment because today we are stepping into a much bigger conversation about the future of Pacific. In a recent article, he proposes a Pacific Charter, a values-based framework meant to guide how Pacific nations engage with each other and with outside powers in an era of growing strategic competition. And for Guam, that raises serious questions. What kind of Pacific are we building? Who sets the rules? And where do we fit in? All right, Brent, welcome back to the Innovate Guam podcast. So happy to have you again. So, really excited to talk about your latest writing with the Pacific
Mm,
Charter.
yeah.
What is the Pacific Charter concept and what core problem is it trying to solve?
Oh, great question. And thanks again for having me back on half a day to everybody on the island. Thoughts and prayers to everyone, my family members on the island with the latest typhoon, but also friends up in Saipan, Tinian are also kind of keeping track in Rota as well. Um, the Pacific Charter specifically isn't really your typical kind of Washington, D.C. or or Canberra kind of policy document trying to talk about how all the ills of the islands could be solved if you just simply followed this advice or adhered to these policies from these capitals many thousands of miles away, disconnected from the realities that folks living on the Pacific Islands deal with every day. And it's not uniform. So that's the first thing. This is not a prescription, if you will, for everyone to like to take. It's really a call for we need to have a vision for the islands that really embraces the islander on the island, not you're an American or you're a Polynesian or you're a Solomon Islander. not a nation state, not a territory, not a region, but what's the common challenges, and embrace the differences of the cultures that are there, but at the same time try to find out where there's a lot of commonality and common concerns. Um, so the idea was to try to trigger this common vision so that issues like economic issues, immigration issues, uh, responding to natural disasters, climate change is one that gets a lot of discussion. But when I look at it, I look at like climate change and the natural disasters as an infrastructure question. How do we
Mm,
work together as Pacific Islanders to solve our common problems? So,
yes.
rising sea levels are great, but there's nothing that the world's going to necessarily do in the meantime. Near term is you got to have piers, airports that can sustain these high winds and inundation from water. And you certainly need to have roads that can survive it and power plants. So what really matters to the livelihood of the Pacific Islander? And I go back, the focus is to try to shift a lot of these capitals like Tokyo, DC, Canberra, Auckland, and even across the islands, like even Fiji, to say, let's not think about this as nation states. Let's look at this and focus in on the islander as the sovereign in this case. And there's a lot of cultural differences. Polynesia has, a lot of tribal history. Of course, there's tribal history in Melanesia as well. But how do we actually try to figure out a way to get at those common interests? So that's what the charter is. There's actually several pillars in there, of course, but that's at its soul. That's what it is, and it's not prescriptive. The idea is to trigger folks in the islands. The governor in American Samoa is very engaged on this, coming up with a lot of really good ideas. I think there's folks also in, of course, Australia is very interested, but they're not a new player in this. But amongst the
Yes.
islands, we've also gotten some interest from the Solomon Islands as well as Papua New Guinea as well. So we'll see how it plays out. And I'm hoping at the Micronesian Island Forum that's coming up might be a chance to continue the discussion, answer questions, but really to really get folks in the region across the Pacific Islands start talking to each other, community to community, island to island.
Yes, yes. So you and your colleague at the Heritage Foundation wrote an article kind of um, illuminating or presenting this concept of the Pacific Charter. And in that article, you draw comparisons to the Charter
Yeah,
and the Helsinki Accords.
yeah.
What lessons from those previous documents and previous history are most relevant to you?
Well, both, but also both are not something you can carbon copy from them and translate and just ship it into the Pacific Charter. So it inspired, but it's not a carbon copy, cut and paste, if you will. Uh, and I'll take each one. So the Atlantic Charter was the United States and the United Kingdom coming together to say, hey, we have a common threat. This was before the United States got into World War II, to say, hey, we have a
Right.
common threat with Nazi Germany. What does it mean for us? What's the world that we want? And it was kind of at its core, it's like, hey, at the end of this war, what do we hope to accomplish? We can't just go back to what it was like before, because we'll just repeat the same problems. And so it was that common vision of focus, and it was a fight for survival, of course, in World War II for the British as well as our country, uh, and hopefully we don't have to repeat that. But that's the inspiration from the Atlantic Charter, and it endured through the war, and then it shaped the post-war. The United
Yes.
Nations. The United Nations is a product of that. So that's one. The other, the Helsinki Accords, doesn't it gets mixed reviews, but I was going to GW at the time, and I remember the People Power movement, Marcos. Uh, that
Yes.
was inspired by, in some respects, the Helsinki Accords, all the way back in the late 70s. And the Helsinki Accords, people kind of poo-poo it and saying it's just a lot of fluffy words. But for the people, again, this is where you can start to see the commonalities. The focus there was not intended, but the people living behind the Iron Curtain were inspired by it. And that's the
Mm,
key thing. And that's kind of like the eureka moment. One, you start to see these people power movements that are kind of inspired by outside the Iron Curtain, the Philippines, in 1986. And then you also see inside the Iron Curtain, bringing down the Berlin Wall, and even communist China's Tiananmen Square was also kind of indirectly kind of successor state to that whole thing. So those two together, a focus on, embrace the idea that, hey, let's focus in on the individual as the sovereign, not necessarily the sovereign like a king, because there's tribal and there's community
Right.
issues, but focusing in on the islander, on the
Yes.
island, not, hey, this is Guam, a territory of America, or Solomon
Right.
Islands, the state of. It's all right, you're on the island of Melita. What are the things that you deal with in Melita inside the Solomon Islands, inside the Pacific? So those were the inspirations, and that's how they inspire it. And again, we can talk a little bit about the economics, the pillars. The religious piece of this too is an important one to kind of perhaps address as well, but not something that's meant to alienate, but to embrace the differences. But at the base of it, it's again the individual's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go kind of straight to some hard questions, right?
Yes.
Without getting overly political, really
Yeah.
get to some real discussion. You know,
Yes.
can the United States credibly support a values-based framework like the one that you're advocating right now? Have we lost
Mm,
credibility with the NATO tensions going on right now,
yeah.
Greenland rhetoric? The Iran conflict, and other things, do you think we've lost our credibility to be able to lead through an alliance values-based framework?
Well, my hope is that the United States doesn't have to be that, because what the Pacific Charter is trying to do is to speak to, again, the islanders, and just say, hey,
Mm,
look, this is just a starting point. What is it what are the values that you see that you want to protect, and what do you want to share that you see as common across all the islands? So it's not it's an unfortunate feature of anything coming out of DC and policy papers and things like that, is it can comes off or be whether or not it was hard to try to keep that in check, but still there's this expectation that, oh, it's a policy prescription, and it's not that. It's not a typical document. It's hard. I do get that criticism. It's definitely warranted, but that's not the intent of the charter. It's here's a starting point, fill in the details, and I tried to get with the limited time that we had. I mean, it's several months, but we tried to put in anecdotal stories, access to veteran affairs hospitals
yeah,
in in the Federated
yeah,
States of Micronesia,
yeah,
access to transportation in Ulithi
yes,
for ferries, access to good jobs or technical training here in Guam to get more contractors and more people, maybe even in Republic of Palau, having people do construction in Peleliu that's supporting government work, but also supporting, a need for more labor. But
yes,
unfortunately, that's often brought from outside the Pacific, when it would be so much better if we pooled the labor and the resources within the islands writ large, and they could come together. So all of that stuff, distance is a common reality. Small communities, widely dispersed, is another reality. Limited services is another reality. How do we deal with that as islanders, and work together for that first? And the values, I mean, that's the idea, is so that we can have a high level of trust, so that we can have,
yes.
so that we can work. And one of the other examples that I like to use on this is the relationship between independent Samoa and American Samoa. There's
Mm,
historical, linguistic. It's like two different. You have an independent, which is not American, and then you have American Samoa, which has a special relationship with the U.S. inside the U.S. Territories and everything. But
yes.
when you kind of to the Samoan or to the Samoans, there's no difference. There is no national. It's a
Mm,
difference without a distinction, and that's, I think, a reality too in many of the islands.
that's a really great point. Now, let's ask the $64,000 question here, because you said a mouthful, but
Yeah.
how do you practically do that? How do you do it in such a way that
Mm.
some of the past lack of trust on inconsistent policies behavior from the great powers, as well
Mhm.
as this being the risk of this just being perceived as a just another geopolitical tool to counter
Mhm.
China. How do we get past all of those kind of feelings,
Mhm.
concerns, issues, and stuff like that? Because they're out there.
Oh yeah. Well, the first thing is focusing on the audience as the islander. So and that doesn't mean you're going to get results. Say like Solomon Islands may not be ready to do much of anything on these lines, and that's fine. But the more the people see and hear, and they experience what other islanders are doing, that's inspired by it, and it's not that it's a framework for or directing actions. It's to inspire actions amongst the islanders. So I would say the governor in American Samoa has quite a lot of interesting ideas in economic development and shipping, and working across with independent Samoa, but also the Cook Islands. So inside there could be little smaller groups of
Mm.
like-minded, and in that
Coalition of
community,
the willing, if you,
yeah, it's kind of a coalition of the willing,
yeah,
but it
yeah,
it it could also, and I would think, inspire perhaps the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, Guam, also coming together and addressing some common interest as well. And so when you get to the practical part, is first focus on the audience. That's not going to eat necessarily expectation of any real specifics unless very wealthy individuals decide to do something on their own. But
right,
that's not a failure, a success or failure. The next thing is conferences like the Pacific Island Forum, the Micronesian Island Forum. These are venues that the idea is to try to have this discussion to say, here's this idea of a Pacific Charter. Have people kind of attack and say, it sounds like you're telling us what we should believe. And say, no, tell us what you believe. And so
yeah,
so if I could be the spark to start that discussion and to knock down the walls and to change the framing or the context of these dialogues from nations and island nations and great powers, it's really the audience is the islander, not these other constructs. So easy to say, hard to deliver. But I
yes,
think
yes,
when there's enough of the people, folks get awareness of that and they start thinking about it, it will then, like you saw in the people power movement in the Philippines and others, it'll trigger a popular movement for things to a better end. And the idea is to keep it focused on a positive, coming together to address labor needs, coming together to address service provisions in ways that might make more sense. There's lots of opportunities, but distance is a challenge, and that we have to embrace that too. Just the distances
yes.
to the Pacific.
Yeah, it's going to require a lot of um, engagement and people soft skills, if you
Yes.
will, in order to sell this and really make this successful. But aspirationally, this could be, something that does inspire,
Yeah.
that does drive action, and really, there's a lot of great possibilities in that. Yeah.
That's definitely the hope. Yes.
So, can you walk us through the charter's core pillars and what do you think of those
Mhm.
core pillars, the one that's going to be the hardest to implement?
Yeah. So, I mean, the sovereignty of the individual is the easiest one. Now, it's not all the countries, not all of the islanders necessarily see it the same way, but that one I think is the easiest. The hardest is going to be in the economic one, and the immigration aspects of that, and that's like the community, a Pacific Island community. It's something that's been language that's been used for many decades, but the approach has been something like more too formalized, like an economic community, which is what the European Union is, or an alliance. That's so this is probably going to be the hardest one to get at because what we want to try to enable is high level of trust so that islanders can move across in between the islands, address labor needs, take advantage of education services like for skills, high skills to do like work for maintenance on shipping, for example, ships, something that I
Yes,
know is an issue in Guam, but also opportunities in other islands. And that's a way to address the distances involved. But the trust between some of the communities and the governments that control the immigration, issues and access and the financial flows, that's probably the hardest one. Now, I don't think it's a high bar because we've been kind of getting at this for years. The Australians tried like a common customs approach, even with like police, but I haven't seen much meaningful on that. Again, it's the trust factor comes into it. So
Yeah.
that's probably the hardest.
Okay. Um, we talked about kind of the hardest or whatever. What
Hmm.
other risks do you see of success of implementing this, in terms of like leadership or follow through or just
Mm.
conflicting incentives between the different parties themselves?
Yeah.
What other risk
Mm.
factors do you see out there that's on your radar scope about things that
Yeah.
might inhibit success?
Yeah, so there's an internal one, which I'll get to the outside, but then there's an external. So there's an expectation, I think, by some of the bigger governments outside the United States is certainly one, as well as Australia, Japan. The expectation would be like, hey, we have all this money and all these resources. We'd like to do more, but then the conditions in which they're putting it might be alienating, may not be a good fit. And it also may not address their specific needs or request, what they would call a return on investment. So that's
Yes,
that's that's a concern. What is it in for me as a Japanese government official or an Australian or American government official from Washington, D.C.? It's like, what's in this for me? So
right,
this also
right,
gets reflected in because it doesn't really get enough attention in Washington, D.C. So if you're someone who wants to get promoted and make more higher and higher rank, we need to change the incentive structure in the governments. And so that's a problem. I think Australia is less of an issue because they're much more proximate to the Pacific Islands, but they're also much more, I guess, insular. They're looking at a very narrow set of islands where they want to be more focused. Melanesia, obviously, is the majority of that. Um, the other is China, and we're very cautious on that. But China is a concern, and it has to be done in the right way. It's like we want to encourage the right behavior, but we also want to ensure and protect against the nefarious, malicious behavior, which we've seen play out all over the world. And that's where illegal fishing comes in. But too hard of an anti-China, like like a cold, we're going to push you out. We're not going to have any China here.
right.
I don't think that's realistic because they do have resources and there is a benefit, but it has to be done in a way that we police what they're doing because they do have ill intent. They are Chinese Communist Party of China, and there is a motive that's not for the benefit of the islander that's also at risk here. But again, if you're too aggressive and anti-China, it can have a chilling effect before you even get started. So that's another concern. Inside the
Yeah,
islands, yeah, inside the islands, there's a dynamic there too. It's not that the islands are fractured. It's not that they can't find a common cause, or hey, we'll let those guys in Polynesia, like centered on American Samoa, do this economic hub and development, and we'll watch to see how that goes and just support it from afar. It's more that the opportunity to work together to try to find similar type of activities might pass before or while the money and the resources from outside might be available. So American Samoa is like on the leading edge of this right now. Again, I went there last year and it informed some of the work. It also it helped that I was able physically to go there and to talk to the governor and talk to folks and get them excited, and also to kind of evaluate and kind of pick and prod on their strategic plans, their vision for American Samoa, specifically Panopano Harbor. But that's a big issue. The final one is distance. It is a reality. It is a
yes,
safeguard for many of the islanders, but it's also a detriment when it comes to economic
yes,
investment and everything. But it's also a key thing is we want senior leadership to come to the islands more often. One, to have an appreciation for the distance, but also for the wide variety of cultures, languages, but also the really remarkable commonality on all of these
yeah,
Pacific Island cultures at the same time. But that senior leadership, it's been a challenge. That's another challenge. So if the charter can gain momentum and it becomes really popular and spreads across enough communities, enough islands, that will make it DC will take notice. So will Beijing, as well Canberra and Tokyo. And it's not all good necessarily, but the more attention, the more senior level attention that comes in that's framed inside or focused. This is the other thing, thinking several steps ahead. If the charter provides a positive vision for how all this can come together, then when you have Chinese senior diplomats coming in businesses, American and Australian, it provides a framework in which better outcomes are more likely.
Yeah. So I'm interested. Um, where does Guam fit into this whole conversation?
Mhm.
Because I feel like through this Pacific Charter, it can be more than just a U.S. platform. It could
Mhm.
evolve to something new, if you
Yeah.
will.
No, I
What do you
think
think?
I leave it up. I mean, to the imagination of the Islanders. I mean, I have from my experience, what I could see in fast forward to 20 years. But to be honest with you, I think I would not prejudge the imagination and creativity of the Islanders to find some really unique opportunities to work together and work across borders, quite frankly, in some cases, and do it in a way that's sanctioned by the governments that are required. Again, this is where the framework comes into play. But I think Guam, yes, specifically about Guam, Guam is the strategic hub of the U.S. in the Western Pacific. There is no
Right.
getting around its military importance. I would suggest embrace it, but it also means that there's a need for high tech competencies, skilled
Right.
labor, welding, electrical,
Yep.
all of these things that you need to repair and sustain military aircraft, ships. Be better if we had the way to train and work with islanders on the island.
Yes.
So not just limited to Guamanians, the folks living in Guam, but more broadly. Now, the other part is economic. I mean, Guam also has university. They have institutions there that should grow. And then Yap, you've got a maritime school. So there's some interesting ways, like on the Merchant Mariners, and getting more sailors with ships and ferry services. There might be an interesting way that Guam could become the hub for maintaining a more robust shipping that's local, so to speak, local across the Western Pacific. That's something I could see. And Guam could be a maritime prosperity zone, which is in legislation, the Ships for America Act.
Right.
It's in the president's executive order. There's no reason that I think would preclude Guam from at least self-nominating, and that might be the trigger. But Guam clearly has a fairly sizable population, it's a very large population relative to the other islands, and it has already the institutional foundation to really become not only the strategic hub for the United States, but also an economic and an industrial hub for the Western Pacific.
Yes. Yes. So, on a previous podcast episode from last month, I had Captain Michael Bacher on, and he's
Mm.
founder and executive director of the Western Pacific Maritime Academy.
Oh,
So
yeah.
he's building up a really great training um, forum based out of Guam and Saipan,
Hmm.
with visions of really expanding throughout the Western Pacific, and they've been doing some really great things. And I'm glad you brought up maritime prosperity zones because
Hmm.
that's something that you can leverage off of. But I think bigger than all of that, what I see is that Guam can has an ability to grow in importance and leadership role to really be the the um, the means with which the United States government works by, through, and with the rest of the Western Pacific, elevating Guam's importance because Guam can connect with the fellow islanders. Guam can build these kind of alliances. There's a closer kind of kinship, etc. If
Hmm.
this is done right, this,
Oh, yeah.
like you said, this true bridge between the United States, the Pacific, and Asia.
No, absolutely. I think in a similar vein, Hawaii had tried, they could not figure out how to do it as a state. And there's no reason why, like, states or even the governor's office in Guam could just start doing this on their own. Start, hey, and trying to find opportunities. It's got to have a strategic. It's got to have a strategic plan. It can't be just a short-term solution or a short-term initiative. It's got to be something like, here's a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan. How does this work?
Yes.
So it has to be move slow and methodical, and do it in a way that the islands and the islanders support and welcome.
Okay. So let's take the opposite view. If this doesn't work, this is
Yeah.
not successful, and we continue on the path that we're on, what do
Yes.
you think that looks like in 10, 15, 20 years if
Yeah.
we don't find some way to kind of unify, coalesce, et
Yeah.
cetera, through the islands of the Pacific?
The worst is that you start to see the Pacific become the new great game, which I've been cautioning about for several years now. And the great game was a power competition between Imperial Russia and British Empire over Afghanistan and Central Asia, and it played out
Yes,
for several decades. The Pacific could become the new great game, and that means you are not your bit players in someone else's agenda, and your voice does
yes,
not matter at all, and your interests do not matter. Now, the United States is perhaps one of the in the American experience, or not the in the human experience, there is no other large power in human history that's been as benign as the American government. It's not perfect, but it's pretty benign when you compare it to, say, the Chinese Empire, like Ming Dynasty, or
yeah,
to Mongol Empire, or to the Persian Empire. There's no, or even the Roman Empire. So there is that. But if we do nothing and we continue the path we're going, you're going to see spheres of influence within the islands where there's a Chinese focus and where heavily indebted, heavily tied economically, to where they're not independent or actually able to do things on their own, but they're reliant on money, resources, and benefits coming from Beijing. And then you have the same kind of response on the other side. It's like, well, then there's the other community. They're going to start focusing on we'll tie ourselves closer and make ourselves even more reliant on whatever comes from Washington D.C. And the same
yes.
thing for the Australians. The Australians will have their own. The New Zealanders, the Japanese may even, but though I don't think that's necessarily in what they have planned or what they want to actually see. But I think you'll see this fracturing, and the Islanders will become more dependent, and they'll have less of an independent voice, and they'll have less control over their own destiny. And it'll be on the whims of Beijing and the whims of DC, the whims of Canberra, the whims of Tokyo. That's the worst. I mean, well, the
Yeah.
absolute worst is we allow ourselves to get into another great war, and that would be with China. And it would include, if you keep China closer, the bad influences closer to mainland China, that means the islands are less a target, less of a military arena. This is the other thing in the back of my mind, is how not to repeat the Pacific War of World War II. Where
Mm,
there, if the Chinese were able to build up bases and places, guess what? Now the Pacific Islands are a front in the next war. That's not good for the islanders. So how do you prevent
right,
that? You basically you set a framework up that's like, hey, we like your good stuff, but none of the bad stuff. Um,
right, right,
so, and
right.
and as an American, I honestly also see that there's a need for more of an American kind of engagement and more presence to push back on that threat. Because if you had to pick a side, at one
But
point
we've
you
been
have to pick a side, though.
neglecting that for years now
Yeah,
because
you
our
know,
focus has been in the Middle East and Southwest Asia and other
yep,
places.
that is
Yeah.
100% correct. So that's perhaps the worst, is that we end up in a war and the islands become a theater of that conflict. Um, and that would be a replay, in some respect, a modern version of 1942 to 45.
Yeah. What's that old saying? History might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
Oh yeah. And the Chinese have
Yeah.
studied that. By the way, the Chinese have studied, and this, again, I'm a China watcher and done that, been engaging and advising very senior people in the U.S. government for like the last 8, 9 years of my naval career. And the Chinese have been studying our military experiences in the Pacific campaigns. They've studied the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy's experiences also. Going, I mean, they look at it from the 30s all the way through the end of the war, and they know that distance is a common challenge, and they also know our weaknesses. So that's why they're investing very heavily to get access and to perhaps even have a foothold. And that's the security agreement with Solomon Islands was perhaps the most obvious. Its explicitness.
Yeah. So really, the key takeaway seems to be like the Pacific Charter and the actions that derive from it is a way of empowering islanders to empower themselves so
Hmm.
that they can shield themselves from being just um, a cog in the great game. As you said,
Yes.
this confrontation between great powers and just
Hmm.
constantly having things done to them rather
Yes.
than them being a partner in
Hmm.
a working with great powers to advance their people's
That's right.
concerns and issues and
Yeah.
quality of life.
No, to coin other phrases was popular is the Pacific Islanders have tremendous agency if they
Yes,
use it. And again, from the history of the Atlantic Charter, the idea is also so that the islanders amongst themselves can say, what is the future that we want? And said, this is
yes,
the so like the Atlantic Charter kind of said, this is what we're fighting for. This is the post-war world that we want. So it's a chance for them. This is not about war. It's about, hey, there's this new Cold War that's going on. What do we want to ensure doesn't change? And what is it that we want to become? What's our vision as Pacific Islanders? And success is not all the island nations sign up for this. Success is two. One island looks to another island state and says, "Hey, let's start working on this." And that's
yes,
success. Success
yes,
is not scale. Success is taking the first step.
yes. So if you were advising Guam's leaders today, um, what would be the top actions you
Mm,
would
yeah.
advise them to take right now to kind of start taking this leadership role and kind of
Yeah.
making some of this stuff happen, not just here on Guam, but throughout the
Mm.
Western Pacific.
Yeah, so now when you're talking about like the governor's office, you got to get tangible. So I mean, the charter is kind of like the visionary, kind of fluffy part of it. But so the first thing is read the charter, comment on the charter publicly. If you want to say, hey, we like it, we don't like it, or we like some parts, but we don't like other, read it, engage, and then start sharing it around and start a dialogue. Number one, that's easy. And a dialogue with perhaps Guam, Saipan, maybe like Chuk and Yap, and certainly Palau, and start talking and say, hey, what parts do you like? How could we use this together? That's one. That's easy. Just a dialogue. Two, um, I think at the Micronesian Island Forum, uh, add that to the agenda. Pacific Charter is, what do we like? Is what can we use it for? Formalize it into one of these forums. Number three, the Chamber of Commerce. Have all the chamber, and I'm very familiar. They all kind of talk to each other, know each other as well. But say, hey, what's a project we could do together? I like the idea of construction. I know the housing prices and construction of new houses is an issue. My uncle tells
Yes,
me all the time about it. So perhaps you say, look, we don't have enough people building construction workers here, and they're all getting sucked up on Big Navy or on Anderson. What about if we could go and recruit from like American Samoa or perhaps Samoa or Papua New Guinea, and we could have some folks that are trained up there that then can come to Guam or come to Guam and be trained up and help build, new houses and stuff like that, and do it at a way that's not a huge cost, like massive cost. Uh,
yes,
and there's a solution there, perhaps, but the idea is let's figure out a way to do it amongst islanders first. Um, and there's perhaps a way the U.S. government can help on that as well. But you got to first figure out, and propose something that works. I think housing, I think that's when I would push on. What is there a way that we can do this amongst islanders and look broadly, maybe a partnership further afield than just Saipan, but looking further afield, like I was saying, like Papua New Guinea uh, or even Fiji.
yeah. Well, wow, Brent. Thank you so much for your incredible insights. This was really a powerful discussion and a reminder that big ideas like this only matter if places like Guam undertake them and engage
Mm.
with them and act with them. So I really appreciate you putting yourself out there, writing this article, posing this concept of a Pacific Charter, because it's a start and a beginning. And now, hopefully, the islands of the Western Pacific will kind of glom onto this and then take it in the direction that they see works best for them. Um, I will put a link in the description to your article
Oh,
at the Heritage Foundation. But do you want to advertise anything that you might be working on right now, or you just recently put out?
yeah.
And also, if people want to get in touch with you, where can they get in touch with you at?
Oh, terrific. So if you ever want to reach me, at theheritage.org, you can find me in the list of experts. You can either just easily do a web search, Brent Sadler. There's a CNN one, that's not me. Though somewhat our pictures look a little different. He's about 20 years older than me, but he's like real estate photographs. They're way out of date. The other way is, of course, going to like follow me on X at Brent D Sadler. But my most recent work that I think that it directly involves the Pacific Islands, though it's not the main focus. There's a paper that came out this past Monday, called Bringing Back the U.S. Maritime Service. And I talk about YAP's fisheries school. I talk about new shipping routes with MR tankers. These are medium range product tankers for moving fuel, and using circuits of these between the islands. And the idea that's not in the paper, but it's behind in between the lines is, well, if you're going to start going and servicing energy needs on the islands and running a circuit, you're going to want to upgrade pier services. You're going to want to upgrade airports. You're going to want to upgrade power. So the idea is that meeting a military need and a local energy need, and if that paper came out on Monday, that's a great one to look at with an idea of like, ooh, there may be more to this, because there is.
Oh, thank you so much. And again, thank you for being a returning guest on the
Yeah.
Innovate Guam podcast. To my audience, I hope you were inspired and learned something. Remember to follow me on all social media platforms, including my Substack. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date on all future episodes. And don't forget to check out my Innovate column in the Pacific Daily News every first and third Friday of each month. See you next time. And remember, whether you're at work, at home, or at play, always innovate. Thank you.